Good evening, and welcome to the studio session that focuses on cruise tourism and sustainability. So tourism, especially cruise tourism, is an integral component of many island nations' plans to grow their blue economy. And the industry supports millions, both directly and indirectly. It's a crucial source of income for many. And already trying to shake off the effects of the pandemic, it must also transform itself structurally. I am joined by two very competent speakers to discuss this topic. I've got Dr. Alexis Papathanasis, Director and Professor from Bremerhaven University of Applied Sciences, Germany, and Dr. Angelos Vlachos, Chief Executive Officer, Kavala Port Authority from Greece, and part of the Board of Directors of Hellenic Ports Association. So I'll start with you, Dr. Alexis. You had a very interesting publication in 2023. You argued that there might be an over-focus on emissions in the cruise sector, which might misrepresent the potentials for this domain. And you also argued that smart technology constitutes an ecosystem that might manage both actors, devices, and controls to optimize ship performances and management. So my question to you is, can you share some examples of what these technological advances could look like to make sustainable blue tourism a possibility?
So let me start by trying to decompose your question a bit and work a bit on terms. When we talk about sustainability, we are talking about several dimensions, namely the three, right?
Yes.
So we're talking about environmental,
Yes.
we're social and economical.
Absolutely.
If we fail to consider them all three, what we're effectively doing is by saving on one side, we are actually creating negative effects on the other. So we need to have a holistic kind of consideration of all three dimensions.
Balanced, if I'm allowed to add.
Balanced, a perfect word for the perfect palette. Go ahead.
And in addition to that, we also need to know that the environmental dimension is not just the ecological one. So there's more than the ecology. And the ecology is more than just the emissions. Obviously in the press, emissions are very easy to communicate, but the discussion is a lot more complicated. And now I'm coming back to the role of technology. There have been technologies and they are developing constantly. If we look at cruise ships, the most, let's say in terms of greenhouse emissions, the most environmentally friendly ones are, you would be surprised, the larger ones. That's not because of the size, it's mostly because the larger ones tend to be newer, which means they have newer technologies on board, which are by definition more environmentally friendly, not because the cruise companies themselves are really eager to promote sustainability, but it's because of profitability. The common denominator between sustainability and profitability is energy efficiency, especially for cruise ships, because for cruise ships, energy costs, because basically you have the hotel area and the transportation, so energy costs are extremely high. Therefore, they have a vested interest, and if you look at the development of the cost structures over the last decades, they've managed to keep all cost categories down except one, and that's energy. Therefore, cruise companies have a vested interest to maintain, let's say, energy costs low. And for that, they apply technology which works towards that objective. So that's the one aspect of it. The other aspect we need to consider is that the ship has a life cycle. So it's being built, it gets operated, and at some point the cruise ship reaches its operational end. Here they talk about ship recycling, but I would also add ship repurposing, for that matter.
Okay, in what way?
You can make it as a hotel, a stationary hotel. You can use it for all kinds of different reasons. They've used also cruise ships now to help transport, let's say, medical help or food to areas affected by crisis.
If I may add to this, I would like to point out that maybe the only thing missing to that is the legislation, at least for certain regions of the globe. I mean, we do have the vision many times, the way my colleague just described, but for certain future actions, my personal experience, also stemming from my government side, now in the past, has to do with our inability, I'm speaking about the European Union frame sometime, to actually implement this sort of vision and future, let's say, second use of cruise ships,
for example.
He described me before. So to my understanding, there's a lack, let's say, of necessary consultation, awareness, and concrete actions by the stakeholders so as certain ideas practically to be transformed at the end of the day without losing more time, because delay is always the problem.
Okay, this brings me did you want to add something?
And now I want to actually come to answer to your question, because you say, can I give examples?
Yes,
so please. I did not forget the question. I was trying to frame it a bit.
Thank you very much.
If we accept that energy efficiency is the main, let's say, the primary driver here, and we put aside things like propulsion, green fuels, special coatings that reduce the friction, those are very important. They have an impact.
Yeah.
But where I see a lot of potential is through, let's say, one is route optimization.
Okay.
By optimizing the speed and the distance traveled to do the different routes. I think that saves a lot of fuel, again, at the interest of the environment as well as the cruise operators. And the other aspect, which I think is very promising and it's still not quite there, is so-called digital twins of ships, which allows basically to simulate what's happening on board from all areas, from navigation down to crowd control, down to food consumption, food and beverage consumption.
Okay.
Now, if you're able to simulate very well, and you start building models, simulation models, which are very accurate, means that you reduce waste.
Yes.
If you reduce, for example, food waste, what you do is you reduce also the food that needs to be carried.
Yes.
You reduce the energy involved with actually treating the waste. And you also save by getting rid of the wasted water. I know it's not allowed, but still many do it, which is again an issue for biodiversity. Okay. So there's a lot to be gained. There's a lot of efficiency room to take advantage of in order to become more sustainable. And I think digital technologies there offer huge possibilities, also for safety, also for route optimization, fuel optimization, and so on and so forth.
Okay, let me throw you a curveball because I do have a follow-up for you, but I want to look at the other side to technological advances. So
the risks.
Yes. What about the cybersecurity aspect of it? I come from the Seychelles. We have a huge informal sector that relies on cruise tourism for jobs and income. Would an overt reliance on these technological advances lead to a loss of income, or do you think that we still cannot do it without the human component?
Okay. Well, ultimately, technologies currently, smart technologies implemented on board from ships, they ultimately increase productivity.
Yes.
Now, the question is, what do you do with this saving on productivity? The question is, what should be automated, what not? What should be optimized and what not? I think there's always a place for human contact. Let me give you a very simple example, and then I'll leave it there and also give my colleague the opportunity to say something. Recently, they started using robots to clean the decks during the night. Okay. A typical example, right? So you still need someone to take care of the robots.
Yes.
But perhaps robots are better equipped to actually clean decks than the people. So I think what's going to happen, there's going to be a skill shift.
Okay.
And this will have interesting consequences also in terms of, let's say, inclusion and the social responsibility aspect of cruise ship employment. Okay. So I see both risks, I also see benefits.
Okay, I like this. Let me bring Dr. Angelis into this conversation. So your experience lies on multiple levels in the tourism industry, especially on blue growth projects. Now, as the CEO for Ports Authority, you know as well as I do that there are lots of challenges around ports management, right? You've got congestion, you've got inadequate infrastructure, you've got climate change impacts. You've raised the point that stakeholder engagement might be lacking in this space. You have given me several great ideas here about how there might be a skills shift required. There might be a reluctance on the side of authorities, however. So my question to you is, what are the biggest regulatory and policy challenges that comes in integrating sustainability into blue tourism?
I will add to what my colleague just depicted very thoroughly before. You have the environmental factor, but at the end of the day, you come with the financial questions. The decarbonization project requires huge amounts of investment.
Yes.
And that's the main reason, until now, I was speaking about the cruise industry, for example, the whole industry has not finally come to an end about what is the optimal fuel, for example. So you have different projects ongoing, but you still do not have finally the light at the end of the tunnel. That's the first one should take into account. Okay. Speaking about the port side, which is actually what I'm representing here, the cost of infrastructure for regional, for provincial, let's say, not the first-rate ports, such as the one I'm running now, it's huge.
Okay.
You cannot do that without having funding from the national funds or from the European Union.
Okay.
So now, actually, the vast majority of the European ports are trying to incorporate in their budgets this sort of, let's say, contributions by the European Union budget. In Europe, for example, because I'm talking by and large based on the European experience and the Mediterranean basin I'm dealing in.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, speaking about the regulatory, let's say, practices and the legislation, you have the national authorities sometimes being quite reluctant to implement even absolutely clear and correct in principle policies under the pressure of their vested interests. This is the truth.
Tell me more.
When you have, I'll tell you more. Speaking about the cruise,
Go for it.
let me give you the juxtaposition. At first, you have two, let's say, major groups comprising and representing decades, dozens of brands.
Yes.
Brand circles.
And they're representing like 80% of the global, let's say, activity.
Okay.
On the other side, you have hundreds in Mediterranean. I'm a member of the Med Cruise Association, representing 157 cruise ports only in the Mediterranean basin, while in the rest of the world there are some other more hundreds.
Yeah.
So, at the first hand, you have some giants, you have some conglomerations, they do exactly know their interests and how to react.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you have separate, let's say, units financially, usually they don't have the strength to fight. Or so, let's say, I would not like to describe it as a fight, but
Yes.
to some manner it's a juxtaposition. So somehow now the request, the stake, I would say, is from the port side to organize themselves so as to be on a somehow more equal basis with the giants of the cruise industry. Because, as I said, this is a particularity one should take into account, that you have all these big, let's say, players in the field. To this respect, if we want to be sincere, speaking about the international organization, such as, for example, I still remain to European Union, but also to world organizations,
Yes.
you have, let's say, lobbying from both sides. You have the environmental concern, but as I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Just behind, you have other things laying down. My understanding is we're coming to some sort of balance at the end of the day. Insofar, the cruise companies have seemed to figure out year by year that it is in their interest to collaborate with the ports,
Yeah.
with the national authorities, and also to show, let's say, a behavior, an approach that could be for mutual benefit for all parties involved. This is the critical issue, to have all parties involved in this sort of activity, to have them somehow satisfied.
Maybe I can add something to this. What Angelos very correctly addressed is the issue of balance of power. And in the ports, you have a typical prisoner's dilemma. Yeah? So how do we put our common interest in front of our individual interest? And this is always the challenge. Interesting enough, the COVID crisis and let's say the no sale period
Yes.
has helped actually reveal what the true balance of power is in the industry, in
And
the supply
what was
chain.
that?
Well, to a certain degree, some ports realize that they're very necessary, right? While other ports have realized that they are not as powerful as they thought they were. So essentially, it also shifted the power between ports, and a lot of ports have emerged, let's say, with a new kind of confidence, allowing them to also dictate to a certain degree, their terms of how they want to be approached by cruise companies. So there's on the one hand the challenge of getting actually the ports together, because at the end of the day, a cruise company, a cruise itinerary is not one port, it's about a region. So you come to those different national things, national, national interests, they collide, regulations that are difficult to harmonize. But on the other hand, ports have now realized, many of them, first of all, they can live without cruise tourism. They manage to survive. And secondly, that they realize that the cruise industry needs them. I mean, what would be, and that's my last word, what would be, let's say, the Western Mediterranean cruise region without Venice or without Dubrovnik, for example?
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Let's put it...
If I may
go ahead.
Continue, and before, let's say, making a comment to my colleague.
Yes.
I would like to, if you believe it to be fruitful, to share with you my personal experience just 7 days before the official declaration of the pandemic, COVID-21, which overwhelmed the whole universe.
Yes.
It happened to be Colombia. It happened to be with a couple of the major representatives of the giants we just mentioned before, the big companies. I still remember and I recall that they were not ready for that.
Okay.
It was happening just after a week. We had the official declaration when all activities ceased worldwide. And I remember them, and I remember top experts in their field, they were not prepared for that. So it took them this sort of overwhelming shock so as to understand first that they should somehow adjust their policies in the future, and they did to some manner. They did it the last 3 or 4 years. Secondly, as my colleague said, some of the ports also have additional sources of revenues. For example, for many of the ports Mediterranean, the marina revenues could be a great source for income.
Cargo.
And many times, I mean, speaking about the tourism,
Yeah.
I'm excluding the commercial use, speaking about the tourism, if we consider the sea tourism and the accommodation of yachts and sailing boats as legitimate source of income from the, let's say, sea tourism side, one might say that in many cases, sea tourism could be much more fruitful for the companies managing, let's say, the ports in several cases. But let me tell you at this point a hidden truth. In so many cases, the cruise activity for many ports around, I would say, Mediterranean, it's not necessarily or primarily a source of revenues, but it's a sort of gift to the local communities, which is given by the port so as the local population, the coastal communities, could also somehow tolerate the commercial activities and the heavy burden of the commercial activities. So it's something we want a cruise, not because necessarily a major part of our profits is getting from the cruise business, but because we want to contribute to the necessary, let's say, to the general, let's say, positive outcome for the broader community surrounding the port. This is something one should take into account.
So that's a very interesting point you've raised. And as we reach the end of this discussion, I think perhaps a line from both of you with respect to the issue of community, because we haven't really heard about the community involvement in this aspect of tourism, right? So you've raised a really excellent point. It might be a gift to the local community. Perhaps we need to be doing a lot more in this space. So my last question to you is, what kind of novel forms of travel experience can we undertake, or new forms of tourism management that might better serve the communities who are in these islands and coastal states?
Okay, if I may jump into this. First of all, I think you tapped into an interesting issue. Now, under what conditions does the local community benefit from cruise tourism? This is the big question.
Yes.
To what extent and when, under what conditions? I would say the one thing is it will benefit when it's competitive as a tourist destination.
Okay.
competitiveness here means that you don't have a touristic monoculture. So you have a diversified portfolio of tourism segments which you serve, and cruise can be a useful add-on. First of all, maybe to generate, let's say, additional income and capacity utilization during the off-season months, which would allow the possibility to lengthen, let's say, the season, which is a very positive aspect, especially for the south, where it's very seasonal. And the other aspect is the business-to-business aspect. In cruising for the destination is not just the cruise customer, the cruise guest, who's the source of income, but the cruise operator and the ship owner themselves. So there's a lot of business-to-business income to be gained by cruise industry, assuming that the economic development of the destination is advanced enough, and secondly, that they have, let's say, a competitive tourism sector, which is not a monoculture and it's diversified. So those are the conditions.
Okay, let me ask Dr. Angelos for his final points as well on this.
I absolutely agree on that.
Yes.
I would say that business-wise, so as to implement these sort of practices, allow me to say that I'm personally quite proud, because the last years we managed something that the cruise industry is looking for, and it's also a request that has been accomplished. No activity can take place without the full engagement of all interested parties, namely all the parts of the community. So, for example, in my port, which is not, evidently it happens in other ports as well, but this is, let's say, the practice and the road we should stick to for the future, is that we organize, we are scheduling, we are discussing, we're making consultation, having the port company as the spearhead, but with the full collaboration of the municipality, of the Chamber of Commerce, and lately even the broader region, because the broader region is also benefited by these passengers of the cruise ship, not just the ship. You know, they go to a range up to some kilometers away. So you need all the parties to be involved, to feel they are equal in this debate, and to understand their benefit for the future actions. In my understanding, this is, let's say, at least vital and indispensable for any move.
May I complement what my colleague Angelo said, just shortly.
Go for it.
When we think about, we need to change the way we think about tourism. Two things. One thing is, tourism is not about just passenger or tourist numbers.
Yes.
There's a lot to it. And secondly, we need to agree, maybe in a way, the mindset should be that we are all tourists and we are all guests. So it's not just the tourists that come, let's say, for one day as day guests. It's not the tourists that come for 1 week as, let's say, hotel stay guests.
Yes.
We also have expatriates. We also have people who stay longer as guests or as tourists in the localities. And we need to consider even our own population. So we need to consider, extend our view of, let's say, tourism attractions and tourism experience, and livability is the key word, and not restricted to short-term visitors, short-term guests, and only their numbers. And this is where I would like to at least end my contribution here. And thank you for the time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So shared benefits, communities, livability, and smart tech. I'd like to thank both of my panelists for their insightful comments.
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
so much.